We got one more guest here for this Wednesday edition of Bang the Book Radio. That is Wes Reynolds, at Wes Reynolds and the number 1 on Twitter. Wes, how's it going today, man?
Hey, Adam. Happy New Year to you and all the listeners out there.
Happy New Year to you as well, Wes. Hope you enjoy the New Year's Eve festivities. And, we start the new year with a really good round of NFL playoff games here this weekend. And to be totally honest with you, in thinking back to previous wild card weekends, I can't remember one that looks like it's going to be as competitive as this set of games.
Yeah, I mean, you look at 3 of the 4 games, the line is 3 or less. And the 4th game involves the defending Super Bowl champions, who are the biggest underdog on the board. So, I mean, I think these are going to be maybe hard games to handicap, but I think that they're going to be interesting ones. And, and we've kind of talked about this through the year, then through the season, that, nobody is really great in the NFL. I mean, there's no real one team that stands out. I mean, the one probably that's the favorite right now, and the one, I guess, with the least weaknesses, if you want to say, glaring weaknesses, are the Saints, and the fact that they have one of the best home field advantages in the playoffs or in the league, and the fact that they have it here for the playoffs. I mean, it's only natural that they're the favorite, but I think this is really competitive, and I think this is the first year in a while where you can really see several of the 12 teams making it to the Super Bowl.
Well, let's go ahead and talk about that for a second then, because I wrote up a futures piece at BangTheBook.com this morning looking at the 12 playoff teams here. And, you've got Seattle and Dallas, who are both in the 30-1 range. They play each other this week. Indianapolis, also a team in the 30-1 range. Philadelphia up there as well. Chicago 10-1. Baltimore in the 11-1 range. The Chargers in the 15-1 range. You've got the Chiefs and the Rams and the Saints and the Patriots, down there with relatively low prices. But I think all 4 of those teams do have some vulnerability to them, as you mentioned. So is this a year where maybe you would look to get involved in the Super Bowl futures market as the playoffs begin?
There's a possibility of that. And, oftentimes, I mean, obviously it's the futures market that gets the most casual bettors to play into the market, because it is the Super Bowl and it's the biggest sporting event of the year. But, I mean, you really do have a lot of teams with chances, and I think this is the year to kind of, because you usually have, I think, at least 1 or 2 clear favorites that are clearly better than the rest. But this year, I think you've got teams that can really get hot this year. Teams that are playing on the wild card round. I mean, what I've personally seen, just in my observations out here, I've seen a lot of Bears money, and I think a lot of people, a lot of casual bettors, even some sharper bettors, that really like this team, even though they haven't been in the playoffs since, I believe, 2010. So. You're seeing them, and you're seeing, sometimes teams do ride away the momentum. I mean, you're even seeing Colts take money at 25-1. So, I mean, this is the year that I think it wouldn't be the worst idea, or I couldn't argue with people taking stabs at some of the longer shots down the board.
Yeah, you mentioned the Bears. I mean, the last time they were in the playoffs, Mitch Trubisky was a senior at Mentor High School here in the state of Ohio. Tariq Cohen was at Bunn High School in North Carolina. Khalil Mack's at Buffalo. I think that was his sophomore year, maybe his junior year. It's been a long time for the Bears. And, of course, they're playing a team that just went through the meat grinder and won the Super Bowl last year. So really like these 4 matchups. And let's talk with a team you know very well, the Indianapolis Colts. Of course, you're in Las Vegas now, but an Indy native. The Colts look really good. I mean, they've got, I would say, the second most potent offense of any playoff team here behind Kansas City. They've got an improving and fast defense. Dangerous team taking money this week.
Yeah, they are. And, I mean, and I can totally see why, because you could make the argument that they should have swept Houston during the regular season. And ironically enough, this game, if you recall, I believe it was back to week 5, when they played week 4 or 5, when they had Houston at home and it was overtime, and it was in the final minute where Indianapolis elected to go for it on 4th and 4 at their own 43, didn't get it, where they probably could have punted to the other end of the field, leaving with Houston with under 20 seconds. And could Houston figuratively get a big play and score? Sure. But more than likely it was going to end up at a tie. And Houston at that point was 0-3 on the season. And they were staring, being winless through 4 games. And they got a win, and that really kind of got maybe a little bit of a gift. And, that really jolted their season. And then, they started to run off a lot of wins. I mean, they really didn't play a good game until week 6 at Jacksonville when they dominated the Jaguars. And then that I think was the real spur for them to go on for the season. But you can also make the argument with the Colts that, they kind of use that as a, hey, we're here to win. We're here for a culture change and trying to develop a winning attitude with this team. They lost the following week to the Jets, and then they rip off 9 of their last 10. And I think they've been relatively healthy. Andrew Luck clearly is the comeback player of the year. And they don't have a lot of stars on offense, but they make it work. They have tight ends. I mean, Eric Swope's going to the Pro Bowl and, is a much different player than he was in Detroit. T.Y. Hilton has been very good and stayed relatively healthy. They've got some good young running backs. But the story of that offense, besides Andrew Luck, is the offensive line. And now you've got it healthy, and you've got 3 number 1 first-round draft picks on that offensive line and a second-round draft pick with Braden Smith. And all of a sudden it's one of the best offensive lines in the league. I mean, they tied with the Saints. Luck tied with Breeze for being the least sacked, what I would call regular starting quarterback in the league. And another reason I think you're seeing him take money is, as good as Deshaun Watson is and as many plays as he can make, he is the most sacked quarterback in the league. He's been sacked 62 times this season. And 12 of those 62 sacks were against two games against the Colts, who really probably, if you were to look at a weakness of theirs, is having a consistent pass rush. And they need to add another pass rusher or 2 in the offseason, I think, to this team. But and part of that is they play a little bit of the old cover 2 that they played years ago in those Tony Dungy, Ron Meeks years. But they were able to get to Deshaun Watson, and Houston was able to get to Andrew Luck. He was only sacked 17 times, but 6 of them were in the 2 meetings to the Houston Texans. So I think who's going to develop a pass rush is going to be key in the game. But at the rate this is going, I think Houston will get some buyback, but at the rate this is going, you could see this as a pick'em or Indianapolis going off as the favorite here.
So let me ask you, Wes, because, we talk about derivative betting a lot on the show here. I mean, is this something where you take a full game position, or you just mentioned the importance of the pass rush? You need to see this with your eyes and then make a live play. What is your approach here?
I mean, it really depends. I mean, I don't know if I will have pregame positions in all 4 games. I mean, I may end up taking like a second half in one of the games, but I mean, I think you're going to see also some teaser plays. If you miss the number, I think that's an option. With games that look, at least on the surface, this competitive, where you can, maybe tease if you like the Colts and you can still tease them up through the 3 and the 7. Same thing with Seattle. Same thing with the Los Angeles Chargers. So, I mean, there's a lot of different ways, I think, to play this more than the traditional, when you're looking at a full slate, where you're playing sides and totals. I mean, so you're looking at different ways to attack. You may look at team totals, and you may look at different plays like that. And I like for that Colts game. I mean, I agree with the line movement, but obviously you don't want to take 1.5 when you maybe could have bought up to 3 or something of that nature. But Colts definitely look like a good teaser candidate.
All right, so look at the other 3 games here: Seattle, Dallas, Chargers, Ravens, and then Eagles and Bears. Anything else stand out to you here? I mean, for example, the Chargers game. We talked about this in the previous segment with Brian Leonard. Situationally, this spot sucks for the Chargers. I mean, it's just bad. 10 a.m. kickoff, cross-country travel, just lost to this team a few weeks ago at home. So this is a Chargers team. I mean, they haven't played an early East Coast game, I think, since week 6, I believe it was, when they took on Cleveland. So, for them, not a great spot, but it is the playoffs. So maybe that's a spot that you would have faded in the first half previously. Now, are you a little bit less sure about a position like that?
It may be one I would want to take more in the first half, too, because that they're going to be motivated because this team, licked them a couple weeks ago. But the thing about the Chargers, as bad as the time situation is for them being the early kickoff on Sunday, they're in their better spot in terms of being on the road. They're a much better road team than they are at home. And I think maybe this is a team that's going to relish this challenge. I mean, they played, obviously, the 8 true road games, but they also played the game in London that you could certainly consider a road game. And, I mean, they went 7-2 against the number, and I believe 8 had won like 7 or 8 games on the road straight up this year. So, I mean, this is a team that you looked at them at home where they don't have as much of a home field advantage at the StubHub Center, a temporary home. I mean, this is a team that lost to Denver at home. They obviously lost to Kansas City at home in week 1. And, I mean, they lost to Baltimore. Even some lesser teams were competitive against them. Cincinnati, where they were a huge favorite, was very competitive with them, with a Cincinnati team that was obviously down Andy Dalton and A.J. Green and knew that their season was pretty much over and were still competitive. I mean, I actually think the Chargers are going to embrace being on the road and like this a lot better. I mean, I think some of their better performances have been on the road. The comeback in Kansas City, the comeback on Sunday Night Football against Pittsburgh. And, you've seen them. I mean, the one concern of theirs, though, is the offense. I mean, they couldn't muster 300 yards against Denver. They obviously couldn't muster 300 yards against Baltimore. They had another home game late where they were under 300 yards. So they got to find a little bit of something with this offense. I think the game plan this time, and Gus Bradley's a pretty respected defensive coordinator, is going to be better against Lamar Jackson. And, I mean, look, credit to him. He keeps winning and finding ways to win, even not being able to really pass for 200 yards on with regularity. But he has had the benefit of facing some weak defenses. The Chargers were the best defense they faced. Now, credit to Baltimore. They outplayed them and deserved to win. But you wonder if, getting a crack at this kid a second time, if the Chargers aren't going to be ready for them, and they would be certainly the direction I would lean in this game.
Yeah, I like that angle too. I think Gus Bradley, great defensive coordinator, terrible head coach. You mentioned getting out on the road, and I mean, the Chargers' most important player is Phillip Rivers, and he's got to get a good night's sleep on the road, being away from his 22 children. And also too for the Chargers here, I mean, moving to Los Angeles, it's a different kind of place than San Diego. Bunch of traffic headaches and, moving your families and all that. It's not really a great place to be an NFL team. And being in this first season there, it is a big transitional period. So getting out on the road where all you worry about football, you can kind of see and put together the pieces of why the Chargers were 8-1 in true road games, 7-2 in true road games, and 9-1 straight up on the road if you include that London game.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I think, this team has been interesting. I mean, there was, a lot of respected observers of the game think that this was the best team in the league at one point, or at least at a couple points this year. So, I mean, these guys, I think, when you have a temporary home and you're in such a transition and, even though you haven't moved far from where you were, but going from San Diego to Los Angeles, it's still a new market. It's still new things to get used to, a new stadium, and, where everything is really new. I mean, they are a franchise that did relocate, even though it was a couple hundred miles away. But, I mean, I think that they have been used to this because you always know that you're going to go on the road for at least 8 games, depending on if you play a neutral game in London or Mexico City or in another market. But, that you're going to have that for 8 games. So they have been, I've marveled at the fact that, how well they've played and how they look more crisp and they look better and they look paired going on road games and some of these home games where they've had some kind of shaky performances. But this is a team that tied to the best record in the AFC or played close, tying for the best record in the AFC, and they're the 5th seed. So I mean, this is a pretty dangerous team here.
All right, I want to transition to a very different market here, and that's college basketball. We got a pretty big slate tonight. We'll have an even bigger slate tomorrow night as teams get through the holiday break and now get into conference play. What changes for you at this point in time, Wes? I mean, again, you've got teams now that are playing in conference. They see these teams twice a year, sometimes 3 times if they play in the conference tournament. How do you approach this thing differently now?
Yeah, I mean, the approach I don't think drastically changes. I mean, because you got to look at least at some of the variance in the scheduling spots in terms of, some games or some teams, played a game maybe right before the Christmas Eve holiday and haven't played since. And then you have some teams that, decided that played on the 28th or the 29th or the 30th, 31st, that, has kind of kept that game every few days schedule going. So you're interested to see some of these teams that are having layoffs at least early. And then I think once we get through the college football national championship game on Monday, then, I mean, even though it's starting now, then you're really getting into earnest conference play, because now you probably had a team that's played at least one game, maybe 2, where they kind of know where they are. And then some of these conferences like the Big Ten that started very early, that had that week in December where they played 2 conference games. I mean, like Indiana is an example of that. They haven't played since before Christmas. Now they go play tomorrow at Illinois. So, I mean, you're going to want to see, I guess, do a little bit of observation, how these teams are going to perform with a layoff. But I don't think, as much changes. I mean, some of these maybe your middle to lower major conferences, you really got to look at the schedule and what they played, because you see some of these teams and they get the snot beat out of them, and they don't win a lot of games, and their records aren't very good, and that gets priced into the spread where you can get a little value with some of these teams, and then all of a sudden they played this competitive non-conference schedule, and then you get that drop in class where now they're playing teams more of their ilk that have the same talent level that they have. So, those are spots that you definitely want to look for over the next couple weeks.
Yeah, and I recorded a video over on our Bang the Book YouTube channel about this on Monday, looking at some strength of schedule discrepancies and things of that sort. And one of the games I isolated, Temple and UCF, and they play tonight down in Orlando. Temple opened a 6.5-point dog in that game, and the line is down to 4.5, pretty much market wide now, because there's a pretty big strength of schedule discrepancy. And because Temple has already played some very tough road games, so shouldn't really bother them. I think that's the biggest thing about conference play is looking at those strength of schedule mismatches and taking those into account.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and I agree with that move on Temple for that game. And I may, even though it's lost a little bit of value, may still end up being on that, or perhaps like Temple first half, because, I mean, when you played those teams like Villanova and even if they're in the middle of conferences like a Georgia or some of these teams that Temple has played, and now all of a sudden you're getting playing at Missouri as well, playing Davidson in a neutral site. Now you're going to get to a point where in a lot of these conferences, yeah, it's more pronounced in especially the bigger conferences like the ACC, where, yeah, there's a gap between the Dukes and the Wake Forest. But in some of these conferences, like the CAA or the SoCon or even lower major conferences, the talent gap really isn't that much. And that's where I think you can really find those spots where you can take advantage of a team that's that's played a tougher schedule in November and December.
Yeah, and I think one last point I would make here is if you have a team that's perennially at the top of its conference and they had a rough non-conference schedule, now's a good time to back them because obviously for, the majority of these college basketball conferences, one, maybe two teams get to the big dance and you have to win your conference tournament or the conference regular season to do it. So I look at a team like Eastern Washington from the Big Sky, for example, really rough non-conference schedule. They're probably a play-on team because their season essentially starts this week. So I think there are a lot of low and mid-majors where you can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And and one thing to take into consideration with some of these, these coaches, they want to test playing these non-conference, competitive non-conference schedule, but it's also recruiting. I remember when Mike Davis was at Texas Southern, I think Johnny Jones has now continued this, where Texas Southern plays, if they have 13 non-conference games, at least 10, 11 of them are on the road, and they're usually against top-tier programs. That's part of recruiting. It's like, hey, we're going to play at Kentucky this year. We're going to play at Kentucky. We're going to play at Indiana. We're going to play at Oregon or Gonzaga, or wherever, Baylor. We're going to play at these kind of more high-profile programs. So that's a recruiting pitch to kids at what you would call the lower major level.
All right, one more item of business I want to talk about on today's show with you, Wes. Golf returns. Feels like it's been forever since we've talked golf here on Bang the Book Radio, but we've got the 2019 Sentry Tournament of Champions. Only 34 players in this field. You had to win an event during the 2018 calendar year to get here. This is, it's in Maui, which doesn't suck, and it's a course where you can really put up some numbers here because it is a long course, but it's also a par 73 and a very forgiving course at that. What else can you tell us about Kapalua, Wes?
Yeah, the fairways are very wide. If you look at some of the scores, by and large, a 4-round 72-hole score, you're going to need to be in at least the low 20s. You've seen a couple years where you shot 30 under. I don't see that necessarily happening this year because the best defense of this course is the wind. And just looking at some pre-tournament forecasts, it looks like especially the first 2 days, you're going to see winds in the mid-20 mile per hour range. So that could keep a lot of guys in this tournament. So, guys are going to have to be used to the wind. I think it gets a little bit more benign over the weekend on Saturday and Sunday. But, it's a forgiving course. It's all Bermuda. It's a Bill Coore and Ben Crenshaw design. And I guess if you look, they obviously did a renovation on Pinehurst number 2. But Trinity Forest, where they've been playing the Byron Nelson, I guess is maybe if you're looking for a course correlation that you could use for this. But, it's a typical, resort, Bermuda fairway, Bermuda grass, some big undulating and slower greens. So, you're going to see guys shoot pretty well here, I think.
So with the wind in the forecast here, did you wind up taking some good wind players that may be positioning themselves for the weekend, or how did you approach your picks for this weekend?
A little bit of both. I did take one that I think plays very well in the wind, and that's Mark Leishman. And another reason I like Leishman, and he's anywhere 25, 30-something to 1, played a lot of competitive golf when a lot of guys were taking off. He played in the World Cup of Golf with Cameron Smith, representing Australia, and they finished second. He also ended up finishing second to Smith in early December in the Australian PGA Championship. And, he's a guy that won at Kuala Lumpur in October. So Leishman was a guy I looked at Patrick Reed in a little bit of the same way in the fact that he was playing competitive golf in late November right before Thanksgiving because he played in a couple of the Race to Dubai events on the European Tour. And he's also a former winner here, won here in 2015. And, as a guy that usually you see kind of get off to a quick start that, will win in the first couple months of the year. So Reed was a guy I liked. Another guy I liked was Webb Simpson, who actually has not been at this tournament for 4 years, but the last 3 times he played this event, he was 3rd, 13th, and 3rd the 3 years running. So he's a guy, and was also 4th last year at the Sony at Waialae in Honolulu. So he's a guy that I think, plays pretty well in Hawaii. And another angle I used for him was that what people call that nappy factor angle, when a player has a child or gets married. He welcomed his 4th child in early December. So, got to spend Christmas with a newborn baby and the holidays, and now has to go back on the road. And I guess you could look at it the opposite way, that maybe, oh God, he's got to go away from a newborn baby. That's going to devastate him. But in a way, I think it's going to work the opposite, where it's like he's got some good feeling. I mean, you just had a child. I mean, it's such an important thing in your life, probably the most important thing. And now, now I'm ready. I'm ready to go out and play golf. I got another maybe mouth to feed, even though, obviously a professional golfer of his caliber isn't starving for money. But, you know what I'm saying. I mean, in terms of those good thoughts, where, you're feeling good, the psychology is good. Now you just go out and play. So Simpson is one I like. This also isn't a tournament where you get a lot of long shots. I mean, you usually, when you have such a small field, it's usually a class player. I mean, I think the last 6 years, a player that's at least won one major championship has won this thing. But Patton Kizzire was a guy I looked at a little bit down the board. He's anywhere from triple digits to 1 to 80 to 1 now at Westgate Superbook USA. Kizzire is a guy that won last year in Hawaii. He actually won the event after this, the Sony Open, in that long playoff. I think it was like 8 holes or something with James Hahn. So, I mean, he might be a long shot, definitely worth taking a stab at.
One last thing I want to ask you about with regard to this tournament. We'll do this quickly here. The Abu Dhabi HSBC Championship coming up actually 2 weeks from today over on the European Tour. Could be a little bit of a distraction for some of the Europeans in this field. A Rory McIlroy, maybe a Francesco Molinari. I know Brooks Koepka committed to play in that event. Do those things concern you? Do look-ahead factors bother you from a golf standpoint?
Not as much, because it's so early in the season. And I think, you're going to have some guys. I mean, guys are playing all different schedules now. I mean, you're going to have some good American players that go play in that desert swing in Abu Dhabi and Dubai, but you're also going to have some European players come over here. I mean, Molinari is going to play. He's already announced he's going to play mostly in the United States. McIlroy is an interesting player to watch this week in the fact that he's qualified for this event several times, but he has never played at this event, never played on this course. So I'm interested to see how he's certainly going to fare, versus some of the guys like Dustin Johnson, who's won twice here, and Thomas, guys that play this event a lot more regularly.
I think our golf content here on Bang the Book Radio is great with Brian Blessing and Wes Reynolds, and we should continue it here through January and February to be sure, because there are some guys that play very, very well in California, some guys that play very well in the Arizona area or the desert events. So we should have a lot of good golf betting thoughts for you here to start out 2019. Wes Reynolds, you can follow his work on Twitter at Wes Reynolds and the number 1. Appreciate the time as always, sir. Thank you so much, and we'll talk to you again next week.
Adam, always a pleasure, brother.